Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be joined today with Cy Richardson from the National Urban League, Ira Feinberg, board member from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, Hazel Dukes, who needs no introduction, but she's the president of the NAACP New York State Conference, Alfonso David, counsel to the governor, Donna Lieberman, executive director, NYCLU, and Dennis Parker, director, ACLU Racial Justice Program. The federal government has taken many actions which directly have been against New York values, against the New York economy, and they've taken many actions that New York has found repugnant to our vision of society and of community. The issue we're talking about today is not just a New York issue. It is a national issue. In my opinion, it violates one of the sacrosanct civil rights, which is the federal government's role to fight against segregation in this country. It's a law that was passed in the 60s. It's fundamental to our concept of a thriving society. And this administration has taken a giant step backwards, not just in time, but also in terms of progress. New York is going to be joining a suit that is filed against the federal government, specifically the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And full disclosure, I was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Clinton, which I'll speak about in a moment. But it is basically a suit against HUD, which is charged with enforcing the anti-segregation law and is basically going to stop enforcing the anti-segregation law in this country, at least through 2020, if not 2024. I'll turn it over to Alfonso David to give you some details of the lawsuit, and then we'll hear from my colleagues.
Thank you, Governor. Today, as you heard from the governor, the state of New York is taking a firm and deliberative and definitive stance against discrimination and segregation in housing. The Fair Housing Act of 1968, which is a federal statute, requires that recipients of federal housing dollars take affirmative steps to further fair housing. Now, that includes taking affirmative steps to reduce residential segregation in our communities. In 2015, under President Obama's administration, the federal agency HUD promulgated a rule for municipalities that is designed to remove barriers and effectively advance integration in our communities. In 2015, the law required that every locality receiving federal housing dollars assess segregation patterns, diagnose the barriers for fair housing, and develop a corrective action plan. A few months ago, the Trump administration announced that it would delay the implementation of this rule, sending a message that the law would no longer be enforced. Today, as you heard from the governor, we are going to be joining a lawsuit with other advocacy organizations to demand that the Trump administration and the HUD Secretary Carson comply with the law. First, the federal government suspended this rule without going through the Administrative Procedures Act, which they're required to do, and they failed to provide sufficient justification for suspending the rule. Second, as a recipient of fair housing funding, the state of New York is also required to affirmatively further fair housing. By suspending this rule and ignoring its obligations under the law, the federal government has made it impossible for New York State and other states to effectively meet their obligations under the law. And third, persistent racial segregation in housing facilitate concentrations of poverty and disparate access to quality education and transportation. This harms New York State, it harms our economy, and we have a responsibility to protect New Yorkers. We cannot underestimate the importance of the Fair Housing Act in addressing vestiges of discrimination and bias that have plagued us for all too long. And today, the governor and the others that you see here at this table are joining in fighting to protect the progress that we have achieved thus far and make sure that we hold the federal government accountable so that all New Yorkers have a chance to succeed.
Thank you, Alfonso. Just to provide you a little context on this issue, it goes to the basic civil rights of this nation. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education said there shall be no segregation in education. Not that we have fulfilled that promise either. But 1968, the Congress passes the Fair Housing Act, the Fair Housing Law, 1 week after Dr. Martin Luther King's murder. It was basically a tribute to Dr. Martin Luther King's work and an acknowledgement of the fact that there is discrimination in society and there is segregation, and there is a federal responsibility to do something about it. The role of enforcing the Fair Housing Law is in the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Now, the law passed in 1968. There have been political back and forths on how the federal government enforced the law. During Republican administrations, you have seen a fluctuation, let's say, in the energy they put into enforcing the law. And there's been controversy. Secretary Romney, Republican, father of Mitt Romney, was HUD secretary, wanted to aggressively enforce the Fair Housing Law, and was basically opposed by President Nixon. Jack Kemp, Republican, did aggressively enforce the Fair Housing Law. So there have been swings as to the energy and vehemence of how Republican administrations have enforced the Fair Housing Law. Nothing like this before, where the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development basically says, we're not going to enforce the law, period, until 2020 or 2024. So not since 1968 have you had this kind of dramatic refusal where they basically say, we don't believe in fighting segregation. We believe it's a socialistic manipulation. And we're just going to withdraw from enforcing the federal law. When I was HUD secretary, I brought thousands of cases under the Fair Housing Law. There are violations every day all across this country. I was very aggressive about it. You have some of the most ugly examples you can imagine. We did cross-burning cases. We did a case against the Ku Klux Klan. I brought a case against the Boston Housing Authority for segregation within a housing authority. So segregation is still very much with us. And to take the position that we're not going to enforce the federal law that would actually fight it is repugnant to everything that the Constitution is about and the 1968 law is about. It's not just a New York issue. Obviously, it's a nationwide issue. But in some ways, I think their position is actually anti-American. The concept of this country is you come, you join the community of America, the community of the state of New York, and we work together and we cooperate. The Trump administration seems hell-bent on fostering division and divisiveness, which is exactly what fighting segregation is supposed to remedy. Segregation in housing, segregation in education are the two primary civil rights battles. Where you live is where you go to school, is your access to transportation, it's your access to jobs. Where you live is life shaping. And when you take the position that we're going to allow segregation rather than combat segregation, which is the role of HUD, you're taking this nation backwards. And that's exactly what the Trump administration is saying. With that, let me turn it over to Hazel Dukes, who's led the NAACP and has always been at the forefront of these battles and is once again. Ms. Dukes.
Governor Cuomo, I am pleased to join with you and other leading advocates in New York to stand up against the federal government. By suspending a critical fair housing regulation, the federal government has undermined the spirit of the Fair Housing Act and launched an attack on the civil rights movement and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As you know, Fair Housing Act was after years of activism and demonstration by groups like the NAACP, the Urban League, and so many others, and leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King, who dreamed of a fairer, more equal America. The act was landmark legislation necessary to end discrimination in housing and eliminate the barriers created by segregation, and it was signed into law days after the assassination of Dr. King. The regulations, adopted in 2015 under President Barack Obama, represented a long overdue strengthening to the legislation and ensure we continue to fight Dr. King's dream. Now the federal government is trying to undo the progress we have made. In New York, we stand with Governor Cuomo against segregation and for the civil rights of all New Yorkers. I applaud the governor for his leadership. Together, we will continue to push back against the federal administration, attempt to tear down the policies and regulations that protect us and protect Dr. Martin Luther King's dream. Let me tell you, as a resident of Roslyn Heights, some years ago, I encountered housing segregation. It was the New York State that came to my rescue after a survey in Roslyn Heights, Long Island. So I understand why I'm here today. I understand why this governor is taking this leadership for all New Yorkers. None of us should be denied. If we have the rent, we have the money to purchase homes wherever we want to live, that's where we should live. NAACP, 109 years old, have fought against segregation and discrimination. Governor, we stand with you.
Thank you. Thank you. I love listening to Hazel Dukes. I'm just inspired every time I hear her. Donna Lieberman from the NYCLU. Donna, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Governor Cuomo, for standing up once again for the principles of equality, fairness, and desegregation. As many of you probably know, the New York Civil Liberties Union is the ACLU of New York, and I want to especially acknowledge my colleague to my left, no political statement, who heads the ACLU Racial Justice Project, Dennis Parker. The Fair Housing Act represented a great promise to undo hundreds of years of injustice by prohibiting not only direct racial discrimination in housing, but also requiring affirmative policies to actually promote racially integrated, affordable housing. Yet 50 years later, New York neighborhoods remain starkly divided along racial lines. Deeply entrenched housing segregation not only affects the daily lives of New Yorkers, but has persisted across generations. Regulations that require fair housing plans to reduce segregation are essential to give the Fair Housing Act real teeth and to ensure that affordable housing is equitable and free from discrimination. The Trump administration's abandonment of the goals of the Fair Housing Act is not only an abandonment of the federal government's legal obligations, but certainly a violation of the spirit behind this historic promise and the memory of Dr. Martin Luther King. It is unconscionable that the Trump regime is rolling back an effort to enforce one of the most critical protections of the civil rights era. To break the cycle of segregation and protect our most vulnerable New Yorkers, we must challenge the Trump administration's attempt to undermine, once again, fair and affordable housing and equality for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. And thank you, Mr. Parker, for joining us, who's the director of the ACLU Racial Justice Program. We knew, Donna, that that was not a political statement when you said that, Dennis, to your left. Because there can't be anyone to your left, Donna. Last but not least, Ira Feinberg from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, which has been on top of this issue from day one. We thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Governor. My name is Ira Feinberg. I'm a partner at the New York office of the law firm Hogan Lovells and a member of the board of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. I'm very pleased to be here today to represent the Lawyers Committee, and we thank Governor Cuomo for giving us the opportunity to participate in this press conference. The Lawyers Committee is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that was formed in 1963 at the request of President Kennedy to mobilize the resources and leadership of the private bar to fight racial discrimination and promote civil rights. The Lawyers Committee's mission remains vitally important today, maybe more so than ever. The Lawyers Committee works to further civil rights in many different subject areas, including voting rights, employment discrimination, and criminal justice reform. But enforcement of the fair housing provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 has always been of critical importance to our mission. The Lawyers Committee is proud to be one of the council that have brought the National Fair Housing Alliance lawsuit that we are discussing today, along with the Relman Law Firm in Washington, D.C., and other civil rights organizations, including the ACLU. And I also wanted to acknowledge the ACLU and Dennis Parker are co-counsel with the Lawyers Committee on that litigation. I also would like to introduce the gentleman on my right, Cy Richardson, Senior Vice President of the National Urban League, which also strongly supports our efforts in this case. The importance of this lawsuit cannot be overstated. The Fair Housing Act has long required local communities to take affirmative steps to further fair housing in exchange for receiving billions of dollars in federal grants from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. But this provision of the Fair Housing Act was not effectively enforced by HUD for decades, and the promises of local communities to use federal housing funds to promote fair housing were simply empty promises. The AFFH rule at issue in this lawsuit for the first time put some teeth into this critically important provision of the Fair Housing Act. It was the careful product of 6 years of testing and development by the Obama administration, and it works. Communities around the country were actually paying attention to what they could do to affirmatively further fair housing, and they were required under the AFFH rule to consider the input of local communities. The action of the Trump administration and HUD Secretary Ben Carson to arbitrarily suspend the operation of this rule is simply lawless and was taken in utter disregard of the rulemaking process required by the Administrative Procedure Act. If left standing, the administration's action would destroy the best chance we have had in decades of actually doing something to turn around entrenched patterns of housing discrimination and the enormous cost to society in terms of increased poverty and lack of educational opportunities. The Lawyers Committee is very pleased that Governor Cuomo and the state of New York recognize the importance of HUD's AFFH rule and are willing to intervene in our lawsuit to try to defend the rule. As Alfonso David said earlier, this rule will help the state and its cities and counties expand housing opportunities for its residents. We applaud New York State's continued willingness to fight the federal government's efforts to roll back the enforcement of our civil rights laws.
Thank you very much, Mr. Feinberg, and everyone else who's joined us today. In sum, what the Fair Housing Law said was if a community is to receive federal funding, you have to comply with the Federal Fair Housing Law. Federal Fair Housing Law says each community must assess patterns of segregation, diagnose ways to fix the segregation, and come up with a corrective action plan. That's affirmatively furthering fair housing. HUD has basically suspended that law and suspended that rule, thereby stopping any intent to say to local communities, you have to break down segregation. And that means they're not enforcing the 1968 law. It's that simple.